One of my favorite pastimes is speaking with Dr. Cadell Last, and I get to have that opportunity today, and I'm extremely happy about that. And Dr. Cadell Last has finished up recently a course on Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Before that, he did work on the extraordinary phenomenology of spirit by Hegel. And Dr. Last will next be teaching a course at philosophyportal.com that anyone can join, and I highly suggest that you do, on Hegel's The Science of Logic, which I have been convinced might be the most overlooked text in all of philosophy. It's always extraordinary when one goes to a book and reads it, or when you have sometimes the first time you read a book, it's just the word passes in front of your eyes, and then later you go back to it and you're like, oh my gosh, is everything here? And it's been an extraordinary experience. I have the honor and privilege of being part of the course with the Science of Logic as an instructor. And I've already had a delightful conversation on my thinking and where my thinking is going involving the science of logic and the tradition of the counter enlightenment. Today, I will be speaking to Dr. Last about his work, his vision for the course, his vision for Philosophy Portal in general, and in general, where he puts his efforts in thinking. So Dr. Last, thank you for being here today. And when does the course start, and how can people sign up for it? I think it's important to get that out of the gate because people should sign up immediately.
All right, so thanks for having me, Daniel,
Of
and
course.
obviously it's always a pleasure to talk to you as well. And just quick correction that it's philosophyportal.online, not
Yes,
.com.
do forgive.
The link, I'm sure the link will be in the
Yes,
description, so
yes.
it won't matter anyway. Yeah, so philosophyportal.online, the course will start January 16th. It will run throughout the formal course will run throughout May, but we'll also have an extended dimension of the course, which invites people who are interested in creating their own interpretations and contributing to the philosophical literature and part of the Philosophy Portal community to continue doing so in a process that will unfold until August. So if you are someone who feels deeply called to philosophy, but have maybe watched a lot of popular videos about philosophy, have maybe scoured the liminal web and listened to some figures in the liminal web about philosophy, but you haven't really investigated the core foundational texts yourself. That's really what Philosophy Portal is for at the moment. And Science of Logic is, in my view, an absolutely foundational text, which is not only representing the core of Hegel's own thought, which is distinct from the phenomenology of spirit there, but I think also introduces us to a type of logic which is extraordinarily important to be able to think contemporary quantum physics, modern technology, day-to-day life, the nature of creativity, and basically the becoming of yourself as a conceptual object, if you want to think about it in that way. So these are the types of big themes that we want to open up, and that I want to open up as I teach the course. And again, like you mentioned, not only are you going to be an instructor in the course, so it's going to be a great opportunity to dive deeper into your own philosophy. If you're interested in learning more about what Daniel Garner means when he says the true isn't the rational and the return to common life, all of that stuff we're going to explore in the course. As well as some other instructors, Layman Pascal, who's a great figure in the liminal web, and Thomas Hamelrich, who's a computer scientist at the University of Copenhagen, William Rupish, who's a physicist, a doctoral candidate and a physicist who's going to be thinking about the science of logic in regards to maths and physics, which I think is incredibly important. Alex Ebert, who is a world famous musician and by all accounts an extremely creative genius of sorts, and he's going and also has a really interesting interpretation and a great grasp of Hegel and the logic. So all of this is going to be a part of the course. So I'm really excited for it, and it's going to be a great way to spend the first half of 2023. And that's my pitch there.
Well, that was an outstanding pitch, and I'm honored to be a part of it and to have the opportunity. I fell in, Layman Pascal's work on the metaphysics of adjacency. I just adored his talk with you, and I always love hearing him speak. Rather at the integral stage, Alex Ebert's paper on the sublation of mathematics has proven infinitely helpful for understanding sections of the science of logic, such as the one in the many, where he's going to be talking about it. And I think his work is very well done. Thomas Hemmelrich, Dr. Hemmelrich on Girard, which I would suggest to anyone, and I had such a great time speaking with him the other day. William, every time he posts something, I'm like, oh, this is freaking fascinating. When he's going through the mathematics and everything, I always appreciate what he has to say, and I always appreciate what you have to say. So it's just wonderful to be part of all of that, and that will be bringing, I think, showing how this new take on logic, this new logic that we find in Hegel, has very widespreading application. Sometimes one can read a book like The Science of Logic and kind of be like, what does this have to do with anything? But the funny thing is, in the same way that air has a lot to do with everything, even though it's invisible, logic has a lot to do with everything. It just seems like it doesn't, because it's like that fish swimming in water that David Foster Wallace talks about. Fish don't know what water is, right? Because they're always in it.
Everyone thinks that they know how to logic, and everyone thinks that their reason and logic is sound, right?
Of course, you wouldn't use it if you didn't. That's the curse, right? Precisely, no one experiences an error as an error, because if you did, you wouldn't do it, right? And that's why I like to talk about the return. It's a problem to stay in common life. One needs to return to common life and reconstitute it. But that becomes the great challenge, because once you leave common life, you don't want to go back. So what does that look like? And I think also as a point, if indeed ontology and epistemology are always linked together, or they're always informing one another, then a new logic is going to have implications for a new ontology. And if indeed, as we move into the world and the world becomes increasingly, quote unquote, alien or different, it will become very important to have a new ontology by which we head into that, which makes me, my first thing I'd want to ask you about is just your original experience and interest in science and what got you into those fields. Because what I've been very impressed by is how you have brought together, say, the cutting edge of science, but also with anthropology and biology and all these things linked together, and how they kind of tie into Hegel and the need for this new logic and how it goes together. So what were your original interests and experience in science?
Yeah, I think that there is, as we've touched on in previous conversations, there is a sort of thread in my intellectual career, that a drive, let's say a rational drive that holds things together in some sort of meaningful unfolding of my intelligibility, I suppose you could say. And Hegel does fall into that in relationship to my early interest being primarily scientific, and that scientific interest was, I suppose it emerged from a presupposition or an assumption that the way in which one attains the truest knowledge is in and through scientific investigation and the scientific method. I saw how far that had brought the human species, and I saw how that form of thought had introduced so many remarkable discoveries, inventions, new thought forms that hadn't previously existed. And underlying all of that, however, which I'm going to be reflecting on a little bit more in the science of logic, was this desire for discovery of other intelligence, was discovery for aliens, actually. And I remember my first sort of thought experiment was to play around with the Drake equation, which is an equation that which estimates the probabilities of whether or not there's other intelligent life in the universe, how probable other intelligent life is in the universe. And to run thought experiments, the first paper I wrote was a guesstimation of how many other intelligent civilizations existed in the universe, given the data we have of other exoplanets and other galaxies and stuff like that. coming to the conclusion that it was unlikely that I was ever going to be able to meet another intelligent civilization or study or analyze another intelligent civilization, I settled for what I perceived to be the next closest thing, which was the great apes. And so I got into anthropology, and so that there was that first, that was like the initial sort of motivations and the initial sort of interest in my young mind, I could say, and so with that mix of interests, sort of it brought together a suite of all the sciences. Basically, I was interested in cosmology, I was interested in physics, I was interested in biology, I was interested in anthropology. So I was always interested in what I suppose from a Hegelian lens you could say were external forms of cognition as sort of discoverable within a scientific tradition. Let's say something like that. Now, one of the interesting things that Hegel mentions in the beginning of the Science of Logic is that when you move from external cognition to internal cognition, so when I think about, for example, cosmology, when I think about physics, when I think about biology, when I think about anthropology, these are all external forms of intelligibility that we all sort of commonly share within a certain scientific frame of reference. But they don't really touch on the internal systems of logic which are necessary for even engaging in that activity in the first place. And the interesting thing that Hegel says about this switch from external cognition to internal cognition is that it's a shift that ultimately involves a move from a universality to a singularity. And so the external cognition is contemplating a universality, the universe as a whole. But it moves through particularity, through my personal life, to sort of the singularity which contemplates that universality. And trying to understand what that singularity is ultimately, where the internal logic is always already unfolding, so to speak, and that move from universality to particularity to singularity is something that naturally unfolds in the course of maturity. He talks about it similar to how ancient peoples would talk about wisdom and how we commonly conceive of wisdom, that wisdom is something that you come into through experience, through a deepening and maturation of your understanding of yourself and life and the world. And Hegel here, when it comes to doing the science of logic, he's emphasizing that the types of things he's talking about are things that cognition requires an education in, especially in the modern world, as the cognition matures. So, as you go through your 20s, as you go through your 30s, as you go through your 40s, this necessity of trying to understand not just the general universality, but understanding the singularity and the way in which that singularity is operating logically becomes more and more essential. So I think that's how it sort of connects the beginning of my career, interested in universality, external scientific cognition, and now coming to the internal dynamics of cognition and singularity.
Outstanding. I had in mind the phrase alien anthropology as you were speaking. So like, and it's kind of like there's little possibility of us encountering aliens externally to carry out anthropology. But what if we as human beings like enter the alien, the anthology are alien? What would it mean to carry out an anthropology on human beings as alien? And that is a fascinating topic. But to do that, it almost by definition requires a new logic, right? Because if it fits into the old logic, it's not alien, right? Exactly. So if there's going to be
you have to understand the internal cognition.
Yes, that's exactly right. And also what you were saying too, on this point of, we mentioned before how in the introduction, Hegel's like, yeah, we've been using the same logic for 2,000 years. I would certainly hope that spirit is elevated to the place where it needs a new logic now. And it was funny reading that because you're like, yeah, that makes sense. And that seems strange. But actually, you can see it in an individual life quite easily. Like when you're a child, you can have a cognition of, say, just binary good and bad, right? And you kind of understand your world. But then you find out that there's a neighboring community and they have different beliefs and do things differently. And you're like, what the heck? Oh, okay. And then you become a teenager and you start feeling things, puberty and whatever, that you can't really understand easily and you need new cognitions. Then maybe you become adult and then pluralism, globalization. Each stage of an individual life is constantly a kind of encounter, and we've talked about this before, a kind of encounter of failure of the inadequacy of your previous conceptual model. That doesn't mean it was bad. It only means that if you don't negate sublate it, it's bad, right? It's like a contingent thing, right? It's, you know, I've always called it like a flip moment, where like you now have to choose if you're going to situate the previous model into the new model, or if you're going to deny the new model. But now we have a problem. That's when you become neurotic and pathological and different things. So if you see in an individual life this sort of movement from stages of cognition, which, you know, is a result of a failure, not necessarily, and this is, you know, this would be another topic. It's not necessarily because you have an enlightened moment where you say, ah, yes, I need a higher form of cognition. Usually what happens is you encounter a failure, like a shortcoming, something alien, right? And then because you encounter the alien, you go, oh, I need to update or transform my cognitive model. And unfortunately, if you can't find the resources to do that, you can have a lot of trouble, right? So just, you know, basically extrapolate that to humanity, right? Where going through history, there's a similar greater and greater encounter with alien that requires more updates of cognition, so that that encounter with the alien is not an encounter with, say, an ancient one out of Lovecraft that reduces us to ash, right? But you see, this is where I think this update on logic becomes so pressing. It's not just like, hey, let's all read the science of logic because, you know, we have some extra time or whatever. If you take seriously the technological singularity, and then I'll give it back to you. If you take, because you know you've done some wonderful work on futurism and Kurzweil and different things, and but if you take all that seriously, well, then there is coming an alien encounter of which a new logic will be necessary. And I mentioned to you how, you know, from the Scottish Enlightenment and them, to me, it was the alienness of what for David Hume, globalization and pluralism would have been alien. Right? So his model does not necessarily update to include that. And that's where I found myself going into a Hegel direction, so that we avoid nihilism, you know, radical, problematic global capitalism or Duginism, right? I was mentioning that to you. And then the other thing is where in the conflict of mind, it became very clear to me, although I have great respect for a lot of, say, the analytical tradition, Popper, even different people, the issue is if those are your only epistemological tools, you end up in what I call conflicts of mind, which is where epistemic responsibility comes in conflict with epistemic possibility. And that leads to a whole lot of trouble. Now, I'd have to get into all that, but, you know, to me, all of that means that an elevation of logic is necessary, because you're entering a encounter with the alien that if you don't update the cognitive model, there's going to be a lot of trouble. But that brings me to the point of Kurzweil, singularity, and things like that, which I know you've done work on.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to stress, and especially for the, you know, for people who do have maybe an introductory background in philosophy, to note sort of really where Hegel's making his intervention here is in relationship to Aristotle and Aristotelian logic. Important to stress that. And there is, and as you brought up, this aspect of the science of logic also struck me as important. In regards to the temporal dimension, the historical dimension, that Hegel, to me, when I pay close attention to what Hegel says about Aristotle and Plato, and I pay attention to what he says about other philosophers. What he specifically says about Plato and Aristotle is never so much that he's never outright negating them or outright rejecting them. And he's certainly not even suggesting that they are, you know, somehow intellectually inferior or intellectually limited in some way. He's more saying that, look, the historicity of our condition is so different that we need new, like, it's not that I'm smarter than Aristotle, it's not that I'm smarter than Plato, it's that the historical condition has changed to such a degree that we need to make the same effort as Aristotle and Plato for this moment. And, you know, and he's calling that forth in the preface as well, that he wants an audience that would reflect the level of attention and the level of awareness that Plato might have received in his time. That he is asking for a lot, you know, of his readers and of his audience, and he's trying to produce something that introduces a paradoxical new dimension of the timeless within time and eternity within history. And what changed in the last 2,000 years is the emergence of the scientific universe. And I think he makes the correct point, which is still correct to this day, in my view, and we can talk about this perhaps a little bit later in the conversation, but that the way in which contemporary logic is taught with the form of logic without any meaningful connection to the content of our personal self-reflection. And that, this is, and this connects to Hegel's assumption that the ancient world could think substance but not subject. And so that's a big part of the whole Hegelian tradition. And ultimately, not only do we have the emergence of the scientific universe, where he's claiming that logic itself needs to be updated towards a scientific paradigm as well, and that this has been long overdue and overlooked, and that we've been able to think external cognition but not internal cognition. And as it relates to sort of what you were saying about the emergence of globalization and pluralism, and I would also add sort of the alienness of a contemporary technology that facilitates globalization and pluralism, is that this would have blown Plato and Aristotle out of the water. This would have blown Hume, and probably blown Hegel out of the water. Like that's how much our world has changed. We have to, and this I would connect to the conversation we already had on my channel, where the types of conflict, the level of conflict, the level of intractability of problems that we face is enormous. And I just want to make a quick point here as it relates to Enlightenment logic, the idea that science and reason lead to a better world, or science and reason progress. Science and reason, that there's this teleological, progression in internal to science and reason. And what Hegel's more saying is that, yes, there is a type of progress in science and reason, of course. That's essential to Hegelian philosophy. However, the type of progress he's talking about is linked to a negativity, meaning that we're progressing to deeper problems. So it's not just this sort of, what I find increasingly as I get older, this banal notion that things are getting better, like science, and if we stick with science and reason, things will just keep getting better. Not really. Science, we should stick with science and reason, but we stick with science and reason and things are going to get more difficult. We're going to confront challenges that our ancestors didn't confront. And now, from a Hegelian perspective and from the perspective of absolute knowing, that means that should be exciting, because we get to think new problems, we get to think new, and from the standpoint of absolute knowing, that's not perceived as turbulence, that's not perceived as disruption, because you include that disruption within your knowing and so forth. But when we extrapolate this science and this process of science and reason to its extreme, we do run into ideas of singularity. And so these ideas of singularity, we can go through this again. We briefly touched on, touched on it when we talked a little bit about a paper in my PhD thesis, is that a singularity in physics, a singularity in mathematics, is a point where basically our knowledge breaks down, our knowledge systems break down. So in physics, it's related to the breakdown of space and time, right? And in math, it's related to sort of the breakdown of finite numbers. So it's this point of, you could even say it's an illogical point within a logical structure. Yeah. Like it's a point of illogic holds together all of the logic you find out. And when it comes to technological singularity, this is stemming from the Kurzweilian tradition, which extends, if we want to get technical in the deep literature, it extends deeper than Kurzweil to I think one of the key landmark texts, which I encourage people to at least read the abstract of this text because in my view, it's the greatest abstract in the history of scientific papers. Wow. By Werner Vinge. It's a paper from 1993 called The Coming Technological Singularity, where basically he just has like 2 short sentences of the abstract, which basically says, humans are gone by 2030. Like it's just, but it's just a hilarious abstract, but I encourage people to read and reflect on that, even if it's to critique or even if it's to poke holes or something like that. But the technological singularity is a point where you extrapolate the processes of it. You extrapolate information processing capacities to such a point where the singularity is in relationship to our intelligibility, that we can no longer understand what's going on. And when you take a look, I also highly recommend people to look at Kurzweil's actual predictions, which go back to the 1990s and the 1980s. some of them are remarkable and, you know, quite prescient. I remember, and the major deadlines that he talks about, which captured my mind as a developing intelligence, was the 2029 prediction and the 2045 prediction. Those are the two big predictions. And not only does he historically participate in those predictions, which is a nice Hegelian loop, meaning he predicts that by 2029, artificial intelligence will be able to completely mimic human speech. And he himself has dedicated his time in the last decades to achieving that at the Google Labs. So that's really interesting that he is a historical participant in his own predictions. It's a very nice philosophical, I think, thing to contemplate. But, you know, and AI today is exploding. You know, like when I was 19, when I was 18, reading about this stuff, and there was a little transhuman community, I felt like, oh, I've got some insider knowledge. Like I'm in some secret group. Like we have this knowledge of like the singularity, you know, like, and it's so like nobody else knows about it. Like, and I even thought about this, like within like my scientific departments and in undergrad and grad schools, like no one's talking about this, and it's like so real. And you know, like, say what you want about it, but it is so real, and now everyone knows about it. The artificial intelligence is coming to the point of everyone knows about it now. It's not like a special little club where only a few people know about this. It's taking over artists, it's taking over writers, it's taking over things that we take as basic human creative functions. And it certainly is, in my view, a more and more a call to deep philosophy, is that we need to think about this like this. And so like this like, to me, what also, and this also we can connect to Hegel, is that what initially exploded my mind so positively when I was first reading about the technological singularity and stuff like that, was that it opened me up to speculative cognition in a way that normal science did not. And it was not just this simple binary of science on the one hand and science fiction on the other hand, like where we have this split between fantasy and reality. It's science is now becoming science fiction.
Right.
You know, like, and this is such an interesting thing to think. I think there's a very obscure interview with Lacan where he says science fiction is the only meaningful science to pay attention to. Yeah. And I think that this is where the technological singularity fascinates me, is that it totally opens speculative cognition. Like the first thing, and this is where like some of my initial writings came, was, well, if Kurzweil, like assuming artificial intelligence can replicate human speech by 2029, or assuming that the collective cognition of, or the collective information processing capacities of computers is by 2045 outstripping the entire human species, what does that mean for anthropology? What does that mean for biology? What does that mean for, you know, I brought it to things like marriage, political governance issues, you know, common life issues. What does this mean? We have to think about this type of stuff. And if there are people like big global organizations making predictions about the future of the human species, and they're not taking these models at least into some consideration, then your models are completely worthless. They don't factor in this technological accelerationism. And so you're not even thinking, you're thinking about a world that is not going to exist in a few years. So these types of things, just they in my early 20s and throughout my 20s, and ultimately writing a PhD thesis about this type of stuff, absolutely fantastic material for thinking. And so just the connection here finally before I pass it on to you with first, is that Hegel's introducing the science of logic in order, he says, to save speculative cognition. He wants to save speculative cognition. That's like one of his big aims, and he thinks that it's an absolute shame and a travesty if we just have scientism and pragmatism and we throw out speculative thinking. And I think that my history and my experience with science is that, wow, science is a lot more interesting and a lot more real when you include speculative thinking. So I'll say that.
Well, that was magnificent, truly. And I think all of that, to point ahead, suggests the desperate need of new schools of thinking that have new logic, because the problem is extremely pressing. And a problem is that the classic college model of thinking probably is not going to update quick enough or fast enough to handle the realities of Well, AI and the singularity and approachments of that, and that will lead to probably very poor responses of as people face that. And it just makes me think of, yeah, like, the new open AI chat technology everyone's talking about. It didn't take 4 weeks for people to be using it to like do therapy, to be replaced, like writing sermons, like just. And I'm driving down the road last night, and I'm in a small town USA, and like the local radio station has a whole program dedicated to it. It didn't, just like that. And the rate of change is extraordinary, and it's only going to continue. A few more things. One of the it's going to be unbelievable. And if you do not have a logical apparatus by which to think about that, you're in massive trouble, like huge trouble. And that's what's coming to me. So for me, again,
I just want to say quickly, I've been aware of this since I was 19, and it is blowing it's blowing my identity away. It isn't going to blow us all. We can do what we can.
If you spent like 10 years or I was writing creative writing since I was 8, like if you've been doing that your whole life and this technology comes out in 4 weeks, it's able to craft a story that's mediocre. But if you craft, what's going to happen is people are going to use it for a first draft, and then they're going to edit it. And it's like getting a first draft could take you a year if it's a really good story. And the fact that people are going to be there, that can shatter you in different ways.
Let me say one thing quickly. This happened to me. This happened last night. So my old I'm still in the listservs of my old doctoral program.
Sure.
And someone last night posted an email which was criticizing my old doctoral supervisor, and it had this 3 paragraphs of text. And it was a pretty accurate, like I've read all of his work, and it was a pretty accurate criticism of his work. And I was like, who wrote this? It was revealed an AI wrote that. So what did the AI do? The AI is able to scan. This guy's got 200, 300 plus publications. It's able to scan 200, 300 plus publications and come up with a nice, tidy 3 paragraphs on accurate criticisms of the work. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah. No, what's going to happen is people are going to use the AI for like quote unquote first drafts or to begin essays or things, and then they'll add the creative layer to it, which then, what does that mean? That means the human must strongly identify with the speculative element, the speculative reasoning that comes after the original traditional reasoning, because the AI is going to do all the traditional reasoning basically way better than you. And there's 2 options with that. One, get really upset because you only know traditional reasoning and the AI is doing that better than you, or go, oh, this is magnificent because now I can focus on speculative reasoning. That's kind of the choice. That's what I've been calling kind of passively the final absolute choice, the identification of the otherness. And, a few more things that come to mind. You mentioned how science, this when you approach science with speculative reasoning, it's like all anew, it's all alive. I found the similar thing, like if you mentioned like religion, for example, when it's like really interested in theology, it's alive, but when it becomes dogma, then it dies, as opposed to when dogma is simply like, we're going to save our progress. When it becomes, no, this is our progress, then it can kind of become pathological and effacing. So there's kind of a, and I think that happens in a lot of different fields. Like in businesses, if they always talk about if a business stops innovating, it collapses. If it's like, well, this is what we've always done and we're not going to do it, well, then they tend to get destroyed by competitors, right? So you actually see, and I could keep going, because I actually think that the role of speculative reasoning secretly unveils itself as being necessary in lots of different fields. It's just not been systematically thought to identify that, except in, Hegel. And this also, I think, gets at why it's so important and also problematic that Hegel is known as just the dialectical thinker, as opposed to moving through the dialectic into speculative reasoning. Now, obviously, the dialectic is an utterly necessary part of his thought. But if you just have a dialectic and it's not in service of speculative reasoning, well, then it's just back and forth, A is A is not A is A is not A. And you're just like, it's not, and you're just going back, as opposed to speculating of what are the conditions that make the categories of A is A arise, and how do we use that as a model? And is that model now run its course, right? That's an entirely different sort of ball game. And I think the other thing I just want to note, and then I'll give it back to you, is, I also wanted to add, in the same way that if you put the singularity at the center of your thinking, logic transforms radically. For me, that's with the truism, the rational. If you put the conflict of mind at the center of your thinking, everything explodes. And, so your truth that organizes your rationality, if it's the conflict of mind, well, then you have to give rise to an entirely different way that thinking operates, an entirely different onto-epistemology. Likewise, if you put the singularity as the truth that is basing your philosophy, well, that explodes everything. Right. And it's funny because the singularity, I've been using this language, like if you put, say, the event that Derrida and all these people, which could be like, either the Lovecraft ancient one or the beatific vision, this thing and that's why I'm always very interested too in the aesthetic experience where there's this suspension of categories. And I do think there were some thinkers like Burke and even Kant in the Third Critique that were like, hey, we really need to pay attention to this sublime where everything breaks down and put that central to our thought. All of this, and then the whole counter-enlightenment, the whole counter-enlightenment was basically, hey, man, at the core of your thinking has to be something that explodes your categories, whether it be common life, whether it be sentiment, whether it be that whole, this is why I place Hegel in the tradition. All of that entire movement is like, you cannot have autonomous rationality, meaning rationality all the way down. Eventually, there comes a point, a singularity where it collapses. And it's fascinating because I think that's so important, because then you see there's actually a philosophical tradition that matches up with the mathematics and the technology and all the things that you are, and then theology, even if you want to include the beatific, that matches all up. And Hegel's like, okay, if all of the fields are freaking convergent, or we see that, what would the new logic look like that placed that singularity at the center of its thinking? And then he goes from there. And then I'll give it back to you. It makes me think of the new school of thinking, the new conceptual models and sort of logics that we need, because it sounds like, it makes me think like when we say like a new logic, someone may hear that and go, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. No. It's literally like based on what's occurring. The AI is occurring. You have pluralism occurring. We're not talking about a new logic out of idealism. It's based on pragmatics.
No, to me, what I think is, and this is a lesson I take from Freud. I just want to say this quick, you can throw it back to you quick. But I take this from Freud, is that, I recognize this as soon as I opened up his 3 essays on sexuality, is that Freud does not approach sexuality through a moralistic lens. At all. He's interested in what sex is in and for itself. And, that's where he got a lot of pushback, like childhood infantile sexuality and stuff like this, And I think my message here for today is do not approach what's happening in modern technology through a moralistic lens.
Right.
Or even have this assumption of humanism.
Right.
What's required here is something which will shatter and break down your categories and shatter and break down what you think is like. I want to say just quickly that when I started my scientific adventure, the true for me was probably the alien.
Sure.
And then as I kept going on, the true was the singularity and stuff like that. But both of those were precisely a dimension which I knew would shatter my categories. Like, for example, if I actually met an alien into other intelligent civilization, yes. All of my preconceptions of what I think is intelligent life or technology or whatever, I want, this encounter. And same with the singularity, is like, breaks down, all of the things that all the structures we have, all the things we take as givens, in your language, all of these things would fall away. So it introduces such a nice opening for, and it's still not, it's precisely an opening for speculative cognition, because you're not, like, I hate this, I saw this a lot in my grad school departments and stuff, this deconstruction of science, like we're going to go in and deconstruct the neuroscientific models or something like that. Not so much that. I'm interested in these neuroscientific models. They don't completely map subjectivity or something, but nonetheless, they introduce something into the real which does change the real universally, not just another mythological system of science and so forth. So yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that I think we should think the technological singularity, we should approach it in a non-moralistic way, and at the same time recognize that ethics is here central at the same time.
I think everything you get out is very important. I think that is where taking seriously Nietzsche's warning of how ethics can kind of get in the way of seeing things clearly, valuing them on your own terms, is really, really important. Everyone's like, oh, is Nietzsche praising like no ethics and no right and wrong. He's like, no, he's concerned about how ethics gets in the way. Well, ethics absolutely gets in the way of speculative reasoning because you're not allowed to think that because, you know, it's a sin or it's a violation of some principle or whatever, right? But if you take seriously the difference between slave morality and master morality is only possible with speculative reasoning because you have to see value in the thing, speculate that there is value in that, and you on yourself say that has value, right? You know, and that is noble, is it? You know, noble and contemptible is the language. I think also this point on the inevitable breakdown of rationality at some point is very, you can replicate it by just trying to reason about this bookcase here all the way down to its most essential elements. There will become a point where your reasoning cannot grasp the phenomenon anymore, right? Like this whole, it's like that to me has always been kind of important, is where this whole notion of reasoning breaking down because there's this point of like extreme complexity that, you know, it breaks down. It actually also occurs if you try to get really, 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 really close to something, right? It breaks down as well if you really try to examine it. And then so you can see where you can just replicate it for yourself. Basically, is, you know, not just, you don't have to necessarily study all of science or religion or art or whatever. You can just phenomenologically replicate this problem if you try to truly reason a given phenomenon down to its essence. At its essence, your reason doesn't reach it.
Yeah, I just want to say that you can apply this to human subjectivity itself. And
absolutely.
Into the context, is that if you know this pathology of you want to know everything about the other, you want to know them in their core, and you look for all of these reasons about what's justifying their core, and at the bottom it's just an emotional breakdown and anxiety. It's like, I'm just holding things together here. There's a meme here where it has all of these different personas or masks, and at the last persona or mask there's just these tears and this explosion of tears.
That's right.
But it's like, it's like, there's just some irrational emotional explosion here at the core, like I'm just holding things together here.
Well, and that brings to mind, like, why there's a real sense in which autonomous rationality actually isn't rational all the way down, because the point is, when you go into these fields, you see there's a point where rationality like reduces down to a point, and right when it's unveiled that rationality is incomplete, it hides. It like abandons ship, as if there's nowhere else to go. And so it's really important, and that's what a lot of these thinkers like David Hume, whatever, his point is like, yeah, you keep saying that you're following, truth to wherever it leads, rationality to wherever it leads, but actually you always just happen to abandon ship right before you find the essential core. Yeah. Isn't that funny? So autonomous rationality is always kind of a bad faith or a fake out or a sleight of hand.
Yeah, and I don't want to take us too far off course here, but I just think it's an important thing to say is that, a thinker like Richard Dawkins was extremely important to me, and again, sure. I would just never just simplistically negate Richard Dawkins. I like studying his speech even to this day. Sure. I think it's important to pay attention to him. However, he set up the Institute for Science and Reason and so forth, and he's a big proponent of science and reason. But his later popular books are on the science of wonder. Yep. And like the wonder of the universe and stuff like this. And actually, Hegel, there's a line in Hegel's Science of Logic where he says wonder is non-rational because it lacks the concept. And so even here, Richard Dawkins, in his pushing reason all to the end, he finds himself in his own irrational core of wonder. And Hegel's even saying this in a way that he's basically saying that, like that the people who are pushing this rationality to this level are actually irrational.
Yes.
So there's a way in which, again, updating to this science of logic does help you and introduces you to a totally whole different field of logical thinking.
Completely.
Which even with someone like a Richard Dawkins, Center of Science and Reason and stuff, it escapes him as well. And I have a practical example of when he was in a conversation with Steven Pinker about cognitive science, where Steven Pinker was introducing him to the fact that people would prefer, and this is independent of intelligence, that people will basically agree and align with their tribe over evidence. And Richard Dawkins here was like extremely depressed. Like, he was like, are you sure it's even independent of intelligence and so forth like that? Like, am I real? Like, and then he immediately in the next podcast conversation he forgot that.
Wow.
He goes back to saying, I am an evidence-based thinker, I'm not tribalist at all. And in the very way he was talking about it was tribalist.
Mm.
You know, so this is where we need Hegel. This is where we need science of logic.
That's such a magnificent case study that I'm going to have to follow that. Oh no, the greatest show on earth, all of these different emphasis. That's why to me, like, it's a different subject, but the fate of beauty is the fate of us. Like, if we treat beauty as if it's a rational category, that means we have a pathological relationship to the ultimate non-rational ground, and we're probably just going to be pathological. And the problem of autonomous rationality is precisely that it's not. But and this is where ethics come in though, if you have like an ethical commitment to autonomous rationality, then as it is unveiled to you that rationality cannot be its own grounding, you'll have to deny it. And you almost become like a martyr. It's almost like a religious martyr at that point. You're like, you just keep going. And even if the consequences are dire, pathological, neurotic, totalitarian, you just keep going because it's a moral category. And that's where for me, there's incompletion to his thinking, but Cliffort's on the ethics of intelligence, where he's trying to argue that being intelligence is ethical. I find that really interesting because the definition of ethical is being rational all the way. Well, that means your definitions of rationality always bring with them an ethical notion, right? And so if you think autonomous rationality is possible, it becomes ethical to try to get it. Unfortunately, though, as it is unveiled to you this is not possible, your ethics kind of makes it ethical to deny that and deny that and deny that and deny that. Now you're going into the sinking pathological problem, right? And I always like, with The Great Divorce, where Lewis is kind of like, hell is basically where you just go on and on, deeper and deeper into yourself, and you just kind of keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking in denial that you're shrinking. And that's indeed what you see with autonomous rationality. But of course, it's understandable, because the moment you start saying, well, actually, rationality has to have a relationship with a non-rational core, well, then everything explodes, right? That's when like Hegel just blows everything up, and that's really scary and difficult. So it's understandable why people have an ethical commitment to autonomous rationality, but it's important to realize that it is an ethical commitment to autonomous rationality, not a epistemologically justified activity, because it is a result of not placing at the center of your thinking something like a singularity, a conflict of mind, a non-rational core, et cetera, so forth. And the thing that this all makes me bring, and it would kind of point to what a new school of this would all mean, like one of the reasons why I really like Hegel and was really taken by Hegel is precisely, you noted this, he's not saying that like Aristotle was wrong. He's not saying he's better than Plato or even Kant, who he's clearly going after the most. He's not saying they're wrong. What he's saying is that the language I kind of think about, and I don't ever know, I think I'm using it correctly from computer science, where they talk about underfitting and overfitting. Like you have a model and you're underfitting it, meaning you don't have enough information yet to say that model applies, or you're overfitting it, meaning you're stuffing the information into a model. You're overfitting the model or you're underfitting the model, right? Well, it's almost like in what you see in Hegel is philosophy in the business of determining bifitting. What's the middle? There's a term for where you do it correct. I think it's like bifitting or something. And it's like duo fitting. Anyway, we'll just call it fittingness. And so like Hegel's like,
this is a nice word.
Yeah, and so Hegel's like, look, Aristotle was fitting for that historical moment. And in fact, it's almost like a contingent objectivity. That's a really weird phrase. I'll have to think about that. He's like, Aristotle was contingently fitting, contingent fittingness almost. You could say that he was fitting for his time. But if we continue to use Aristotle, we're now overfitting. We are trying to overfit Aristotle, the same with Kant and all those people. But what's so important is Hegel's also saying is you had to go through that phase of fittedness to get here. Right? So you can't say he's wrong because it's necessary, right? So likewise, the scientific revolution that had to act, they basically had to act as if autonomous rationality was possible, precisely to get the advances of it and get to the point now where you can start thinking, no, there's an incompleteness to autonomous rationality, right? So it's all about overfitting and underfitting. And to me, when we talk about like a new school or new conceptual mappings, traditionally thinking has been right or wrong. Right? Education is about being right, not wrong, right? Well, now we're talking about a logic that's in the business of under and overfitting and fittingness, right? So that changes entirely how you approach things, right? Like, it's not like, oh, these people are wrong, these people are right. You're like, okay, these people are fitting up to this point, but they're overfitting past that point. And what is the thought that's going to be fitting? And that's going to require, of course, speculation to determine what will be fitting, because you cannot assume what you currently have is going to be fitting for what is coming. And in fact, if it's alien, it basically can, almost by definition. So there's epistemology as fittingness. This makes me think of Master Pascal on the grip, the bird, the holding. When do you hold? When do you let go? There's this kind of epistemology of grip. And, to its defense, I feel as if the best parts of like some of the integral, the spiral, all of that is kind of talking about this new way of thinking and this new logic. And it's just, I think there is overlap with Hegel, but there are differences, but I'm always interested in finding those overlaps. And there is this sense of this kind of gripping and this undergrip. But of course, the issue is, I think you have to go to Hegel to get a logic of that gripping, as opposed to just a feeling that you need that gripping based on the personal experience of paradox, right? So that's what's kind of funny, is like Hegel's trying to make a really kind of hard, hard quote unquote logic of a contingent fittingness, right? And that requires an entirely new thinking. Because for me, the reason why I had to go to kind of Hegel basically is, it's one thing to say, like with James Hunter, with substantive democracy, it's one thing to say that difference is good, that diversity is good, and entirely another thing to have a logic of which places diversity within the business of the very conceptual structure that you're considering, right? Like if you're still in AA logic, then when you say difference is good, what? How can it be? A is A. So difference by definition is a threat to A is A logic, right? So when you have like a pluralism or a lot of the postmodern notions where difference is good, it's good to follow those things. Without a new logic, it's almost like it can't fit. It has to be a pathological thing. And that's what's happening, right? People kind of know emotionally and experientially that difference is supposed to be good, but they don't have a logic to fit how it can be good, because they're still in A is A thinking. So then it's all pathological, right? Like from what you know emotionally and personally, you're supposed to, following the social script where diversity is good, you're supposed to care, but you don't have the logic to where that can be robust in your thinking. So everything's a confused mess, of course. And that's why I think Hegel is so important. And that also is why I find myself having to go from Hume to Hegel, even though I would have never imagined I do that, because you have to get a robust logic on which to hang the notion of diversity having a role in your very logic, as opposed to just simply a social script where you say that diversity is good. It has to be deep. It has to be very, very deep.
Yeah, and then when we have to include Freud, because that deepness has to go to the level of the libido and stuff like
exactly.
that.
Oh, but that's exactly right.
And that's important for common life as well. So yeah, and we think about what is this new school, and I have some experience here, and I also have a lot of failure here with thinking about this and doing this. One of the projects that I was involved in towards the end of my doctoral thesis was on a project called the School of Thinking, which is still operative this year, not operative, but hopefully in future years will continue to be operative. And the goal there was to explore thought. The goal there was to explore different thought forms, with the idea of potentially reinventing, I suppose, the way in which interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work is done. Now failure. Now coming to the failure, I think that, and I want to be careful here with like how I frame the failure, but if I could connect it to what I'm thinking now and what I'm doing now, my role in the School of Thinking was basically to teach dialectical thinking and dialectical thought form. And then you'd have other people who were teaching cognitive science thinking. You'd have other people teaching ethical thinking. You'd have other people thinking all sorts of different thought forms. And that was sort of like the program as a whole. Now, I would say, following the science of logic, that the problem with the School of Thinking and what the hard work that really needs to be done, the question is, how is it to be done? Is that it's not enough to just teach people a multiplicity of thought forms. It has to be demonstrated how those thought forms are connected to personal content. And so that's why like the papers I would write for the School of Thinking would be about the well, I do have a paper that I wrote for the School of Thinking, which is in the first School of Thinking handbook, which is basically saying the personal is intellectual and the intellectual is personal. So you need to like one, you need to think about the personal contents of your life as intellectual materials. You have to think the personal contents of your life. And then the intellectual is personal, meaning that the intellectual forms that you are attracted to are reflecting a personal dimension. Like, for example, why was I interested in cosmology? Because I was personally interested in countering the alien.
Yes.
Right. It wasn't I was just interested in cosmology. Like there was a personal dimension in there as well. And then when it comes to sort of the intellectual or the personal is intellectual is like that's where I just resonated so much with psychoanalysis over cognitive science, because psychoanalysis takes the personal contents of your dreams, your libidinal fantasies, your neurotic attachments, your fixations as its material. So there's a way in which I could say, the whole institution of psychoanalytic inquiry is an embodiment of the science of logic and Hegel's science of logic. At the same time, we have and also perhaps communism was also a sort of an attempt to embody the science of logic as well. Now, we could say, okay, well, communism and psychoanalysis have not ushered us into a utopia or of like transparent thought and harmonious community, right? We're the unconscious is there's a negativity irreducible to the unconscious, where the like Alenka Zupancic will say, what is to be known at the core of the unconscious is nothing at all. So again, back to Hegel's science of logic and being and nothing. And then with the communist project, there is probably what I see in the communist project a type of utopianization of the idea of community. And of course, I'm not against community. I'm not against thinking in communal ways, but we have to be aware of how messy and negative the actual community life is and how difficult that is. And I'm sort of against the utopianization or the idealization of human community. But at the same time, of course, we need to approach these things. We need to think these things. And so my major point here is that what a school of thinking, if like, I'm just getting ideas like maybe I should do this with a philosophy portal in the future, is that, what would a school of thinking look like that included the personal and put the logical form and the personal content into closer dialogue? How do we do that? What would that look like? Then you cannot escape, and this is like the ultimate impossibility for thought, is the political, the economic dimension. Like, can we think like very, and here like very basic philosophical categories that we inherit from Plato and Aristotle, the power and the one, it's hard to get out of a one with power, even if it's obfuscated, even if it's disavowed. No, look at how power operates. It's hard to get out of a model of the one. And with economics, I mean, it's hard not to agree with a type of Marxist reduction to capitalistic reproduction, especially today with surplus value of capital reproducing itself, even independent of human use value. How do we approach these problems? How do we think these problems? I was just having a conversation today about, again, in the context of like, if artificial intelligence is going to be a bigger revolution than the internet, and the internets have totally eroded all of our institutional frameworks, well, artificial intelligence is just the hollowing out of our use function. And that's how capitalism values us. And so all of these are just, we need to think these things. So I want to emphasize again, and think we've emphasized throughout this conversation, we are like very contemporary in our thought. We're not trying to just go back to what was just a historicist reading of what did Hegel think here. We need to go through this process of reading these foundational modernist texts in order so that we are not making silly mistakes in our thinking today.
That was magnificent. A few things. The silly mistakes in our thinking today can be utterly catastrophic. And that's another reason why going back and doing this work is very important. Like you almost have like in a lot of the people who study Girard and though Girard has become very popular, there's almost like this kind of we're doomed, right? Like eventually the nuclear weapons and the mimetic desire will screw us all, right? Unless we can think new or something, right? And likewise, I was talking to you, I've been revisiting after our last talk, David Douche, and he's always kind of like stressing, he's like, we need to be very careful to suggest there are inherent limitations in principle to knowledge, because if you start saying that, then you're like, well, we're doomed. We're just a bunch of like, animals who know how to think, and there's a certain limit, and that's where he goes after the Feria paradox and all these other things. And I think that's very important. But this is why, like, basically A is A thinking, when you overfit it, leads you to various fatalisms, various sort of like we're doomed. So you either like, there's like two things. One, in A is A, you pathologically deny the coming problem, and then you run into it and your response is pathological, or you get all these problems. Or two, you become like, there's nothing we can do, it's hopeless. And there's like, those are like the two roads basically in A is A thinking. Well, if you don't want to do one of those two roads, then you need AB thinking, as I categorize it, or you're going back to Hegel, a new logic, we can just say, right? A few more things. A lot of what you said, it would be difficult for me to stress how much I resonated. If I were to put it very generally, there's a sense where what you're talking in your journey, there's a realization where, and just, we can language this in different ways, where kind of science ignores the libido. Like eventually you're like, the science ignores the libido. For me, the way I put it is that philosophy ignored motivation, is what I kept experiencing. And when I say philosophy, I almost want to say metaphysics, because I want to include theology, because my experience is that religion ignored motivation, right? And what's funny is like the libido and motivation are very similar. I thought of the term motivation because I was going like, philosophy doesn't think economics, philosophy doesn't think art, was basically the two categories that I really focused on. And I was like, oh my gosh, if you take seriously the problem of motivation, everything changes real fast and becomes a big deal. And philosophy and theology were not taking those seriously. So that's where I got into economics, art, and then sociology, because in sociology, the philosophical sociologists, they're basically like, yeah, difference is deep. Difference is really deep. And people don't like each other, by the way. They say they like each other. They don't like each other. No, they don't like each other. No, people don't like each other. You're full of crap. Yeah. And then also when you explore,
if I meet someone who has a naive view about liking other humans, I'm like, okay, you got a long way.
We got to go. Well, and that's actually like, it's very difficult to read great literature and not go, yeah, people suck. Like one of the great lessons of great literature is that people suck, right? Like, and that's great art as well. And it's really, really hard not to suck. Basically, really difficult. Yeah. And basically for me, in my field, the fields I focused on, when motivation was not central, everything went to crap. So let's take economics. The best economic thinkers, in my opinion, have the question of motivation central to their thought. And it's not about like profits. It's not necessarily about any of the business models. It's like, what motivates human beings, right? And how do beings be motivated? When economics got away from that, now you have all this pathological problem that you have, right? And you have corporatism and blah, blah, blah. And that's an extensive subject, right? Likewise, when philosophy and theology gets away from the questions of motivation, well, philosophy just ultimately, it ends up just being deconstructed. And ultimately, it becomes about moral systems, or theology becomes about dogma, but it's not really taking serious. It's basically all of them end up saying, if you have the right ideas, you'll be motivated to do the right ideas. No, that is not true. And basically science in the rationalist community has the same notion, right? It's like, oh, if we know the truth, people will do the truth, right? No, because people frame the truth in line with their libido, dang it. So, basically that set of science without libido equals bad, and basically philosophy without motivation is bad. And of course they overlap in different ways. And it's all, that's why for me, like the crown jewel has a lot to do with intrinsic motivation, right? And it seems like the crown jewel has a lot to do with negating, sublating libido into terms of a integration with lack, right? And you see the question of motivation or desire, there's different, to me, they overlap so much. They're basically the same thing. That's missing. And of course it's missing because we kicked out the subject. We kicked out the person. The subject is the point in the universe where motivation enters the picture. It's where desire enters the picture. Yeah, yes. And the singularity is ultimately where that cannot be denied. And it's like the human is basically stripped of everything but that raw desire and that raw motivation. And the question is the following. Okay, if that's all the human has now, basically they have to become the source of it without reliance on anything external, or they're going to be effaced. And that's why it becomes like intrinsic motivation. If you look out on the world and the AI is doing everything better than you, and the AI is better than everything, and you're looking for motivation externally, you ain't going to find it. You're not going to find it at all. And so you have to be intrinsically motivated. And to me, that's why all this AB stuff gets to like the heart of intrinsic motivation, because the key move for me is that essential incompleteness with a little bit of understanding suddenly becomes essential unlimitedness. We have to get to the place where we have a logic. A is A can only encounter incompleteness as incompleteness in a like pathological effacing way, right? You're like, oh, we're incomplete. We suck. The AI is not incomplete. AI is better. AI takes over the world. But if suddenly you go, no. The essential incompleteness of the human subject is precisely why they are essentially unlimited, because there's no completion. But that requires creative thinking. That requires speculative reasoning. The only possibility of incompleteness leading to unlimited creativity is if speculative reasoning is central, and that requires a logic, a new logic by which it may be central. Without that, we're in huge trouble.
Yeah, I just want to say quickly here that there was a very famous publication by the Club of Rome in the 1970s, which was titled "The Limits of Growth." But what they didn't think was the growth of limits.
Yes.
So you got to flip. And so what I mean by the growth of limits is that they thought that given our current population growth, that we would not be able to feed the planet by 2000. And what they didn't take into consideration was the growth of our very technological infrastructure and the agricultural products to be able to meet the demands of more people on the planet. And actually, if you take the logic of the growth of limits in regards to contemporary technology, I mean, you can go pretty far, meaning that in principle, we could have trillions of people on the planet and be fine, so it's a huge thing to think, the unlimitedness, growth of limits, how far can it go? In my readings, you reach hard limits of physics and you reach hard limits of computation, but those limits are so far away from what we're currently capable of observing and doing that, it's impossible to say what consciousness or what knowing will know or be able to do at that standpoint. Meaning, if you are at the physical limit of what we think today, or if you are at the computational limit of what we think the limits of computation is today, what does the universe look like from that standpoint? We don't know that. That's an impossible thing to know. So yeah, this is the type, but this is the type now. But now, just me saying that, you take that, you isolate you isolate those two facts. It's like the physical limits and the computational limits. Well, that gives you a lifetime of speculative thinking.
Yes.
That's huge. That's huge.
It's unbelievable. So a few things. One, if the noumenon exists to us as a thing that keeps us from getting to the things ourselves, that metaphorically structures all of our thinkings as a limit, as something we do not cross, and that's static, right? But if suddenly the noumenon is a product of the phenomenon, then the limit is something that moves. Limits can move. So this is
practically, like the examples I just gave are very practically reasons why Kantian reason is not a solution here.
No, not at all.
So that's very practical.
Well, for me, a massive example of where the specter of Kant haunts. And again, am I anti-Kant? You
No,
can
no.
overfit Kant. That's the
Yeah,
problem.
yeah.
And in
That's the right
fact,
way to
I
think of it.
think you get a much better reading of Kant. I think you actually, to really get a good reading of Kant, although I'm no expert, you have to read all of the critiques simultaneous. Like, you cannot separate the third critique for the first critique. That's, I think, very important. But anyway, a great example of where this, just to your point on the limits of growth, Malthusianism, all these different things. A very good example of where the spectrum of Kant has screwed us is in economics, because there's a notion that economics is the classical, very simple 101 definition is economics is the distribution of limited resources. Okay, well, that means there's a noumenon, there's a limit, and we have to figure out how to distribute on this side of the noumenon, right? This is where, for me, making the source of value right now in economics is scarcity. Something is valuable because it is scarce. That's slave morality. That's Nietzschean slave morality. There's a scarcity, and good is not scarce. So good is simply defined as not bad. That's where Nietzsche's whole critique of slave morality is. There's no actual good. It's just not bad, right? Where in master morality, good is good in of itself. Okay, so economics is basically like scarcity. It's weird because scarcity is bad and yet simultaneously good, because it makes something valuable. So you have this pathological relationship, right? And then everything has to trade and distribute and monopolies and everything gets fun. But what if actually the source of value is not scarcity? Scarcity is just an expression of one kind of value. What if the source of value is creativity? There is no fundamental limit to creativity. And what if at the core of the value of economics is a dialectic between energy and creativity? And that's what I talk about a lot. The use of energy and the creativity, right? There is no, just if I'm referencing how Deuce will talk about, Dr. Deuce will talk about how there's no fundamental limit to knowledge, because I mentioned him.
David Deutsch.
David, I'm sorry, you're right. I can't. I said douche. Wow,
then you're calling him a douche.
Wow, I've done that Deutsch. Wow, I am
Deutsch.
Totally a country bumpkin saying douche when it's Deutsch. Wow,
It's
I feel
okay.
like
when I started doing continental philosophy videos, I think I said ficht instead of fichte. But
no, I never get the W thing. No.
I don't think I'm here. I don't think we should be too harsh on people when they do mispronunciation of names. Like, we should give people the benefit of the doubt here.
I agree. I definitely need the entire internet to give me benefit of the doubt on the mispronunciation of words, because I had to take sign language for a long time so I could avoid talking because I'm so bad at it. But anyway, so David Deutsch, says there is no fundamental limit to knowledge, and that this is very important. There is no fundamental limit to energy. Maybe fossil fuels, but to energy itself, not necessarily. Nor is there a fundamental limit to creativity. So suddenly, if a dialectic between creativity and energy is the fundamental source of your economy, there's no necessary limit to growth, only a contingent limit, right? Based on the new creativity. And this is why I think Dietrich Miklowski's work is utterly important, and Vladolf, Smil, who talks about energy economics, like putting them together completely transforms your economic model. But guess what? If you're still stuck in AA logic, if you're still kind of thinking Kant, then that possibility of a dialectical relationship between those two fundamentals to give rise to the possibility of basically infinite growth that is not necessarily cancerous is not even in your picture. And so this is an example of where new logic following Hegel has an incredibly practical, it incredibly impacts how you speculative reason in economics. If you don't have Hegel, if you don't have speculative reasoning, then you become an expert in the distribution of limited resources, because that's all there is. And there's a dialectic between scarcity and non-scarcity, money and not. Everything is like, back and forth between those. But it's a dialectic that ultimately just becomes a dichotomy, because without speculative, and that's a point I actually wanted to make. Without speculative reasoning, basically dialectics almost just have to be dichotomies, right? They can't be moving. The speculative reason is needed for there to be a kind of drive to the dialectic, right? And so what ends up happening, and that's why it's dangerous to say that Hegel is just the dialectical thing. I don't think, that's not what Hegel scholars mean, obviously. Hegel's dialectic is a big deal, but it has to be tied to a speculative reasoning so that the dialectic is not merely a dichotomy that's moving back and forth, right? And so you see, without speculative reasoning, then the expert at economics is simply going to be moving back and forth between the various dichotomies. And this is where someone like Derrida is great, because he's like, and postmodernity is great because they're like, dichotomies are problematic. The problem is you have postmodernity without speculative reason ends up becoming deconstruction, nihilistic deconstruction, as opposed to a kind of clearing to make possible something new. This and more can be said on that, but the point is the lack of speculative reasoning determines the world you live in. And so if you in economics don't have that, then you're just going to be moving chess pieces around on a board that the board itself is fundamentally pathological. And because it's stuck in AA categories, right? And so economics, and then I think you could say very similar things with sociology, politics, and I could keep going. But economics is a very good example of where being stuck in AA thinking is really consequential and just incredibly practical.
Yeah, definitely. I think, I was listening to this talk about cognitive science, and there was a really interesting question from the audience talking about how do the models of cognitive science and evolutionary psychology as well factor in their assumption of the evolutionary background? Because when you because they do have the evolutionary background as an assumption, but the problem of that is that our contemporary environment is really not similar at all to our evolutionary background. So it's like, and the main thing here that was brought up here by the panel of cognitive scientists was an example was a very important variable is scarcity, that a lot of our models are reasoned from the point of view of scarcity. And funny enough, Hegel foresaw this, and and what he identified was this paradox of scarcity and abundance, because he said that actually we assume that scarcity is the problem, but actually abundance is the problem.
Right.
And and there's all sorts of cognitive science studies now about the paradox of abundance. When you have an abundance of choice, you don't make a choice. Yeah. When you have when you have few choices, you do make a choice. And I think a lot of people today are paralyzed by the abundance before them, specifically an abundance of things which in our evolutionary background there was not an abundance of. I mean, I think here going basically to the sex drive and the oral drive, our food drive, are two examples where people here today are the modern human is struggling with these very basic simple dimensions of life as a consequence of abundance being a problem and not scarcity. And I think that when we think about our consciousness, I like that there's this Indian yogi who said that you give a dog or a cat all the food, water, and shelter they need, and the problem is solved. But he said if you give humans food, water, and shelter, the problem begins. So that's a really nice point where, and I think I think the reason I bring that up is because I think that's a good way to think about, whenever there's like leftist sort of tendencies towards a utopian thinking of like basic income, for example. Like, let's say that we do get a basic income, and I think a lot of people today would say, hooray, problem solved. But I think from a certain point of view, you could say, uh-oh, problems beginning.
100%.
And so there's a whole dimension of the psychology, like you go take, for example, like, and this is where I think some of the humanist psychology models are a little bit overfit, let's say, where you have this pyramid going to creativity, and you have, like, for example, Maslow doing a whole study on like the further reaches of human nature, where he does a study of like very creative people, but like he doesn't go into, I've read that book several times, and he doesn't go into sort of the affective disturbances involved in creativity, and the fact that and Zizek talks about this a lot in Less Than Nothing, is that we are creative because we are inwardly constantly in a sort of imminent and self-antagonism. And like this imminent self-antagonism spurs us to creative drive. And so yeah, I mean, like, let's imagine, I mean, I'm not against let's doing a real political economic redistribution of the way we think economics given the artificial intelligence environment and stuff like that. But then I'm just saying here, now problems begin, thinking is required, philosophy might begin, like a new, like even a different type of what we think of philosophy.
Well, a few things to that was so outstanding is, I don't think it's by chance that, so there's this kind of idea that if you were to erase scarcity, the game's over, we've won. Right. I don't think it's by chance that precisely when you've kind of gotten to this point at the 20th century with philosophy, where people are like, philosophy's over, we won, neo-pragmatism, deconstruction, it's science. Philosophy is just trolley problem. Zizek appears. It's right here where you think that philosophy's over, that it's run its course and now it can be replaced by science. That then Zizek shows up and he's like, hey, turns out you missed something. And I think yeah, exactly. And you see what you were saying on universal basic income. You see, the issue that ends up happening is so basically, it's only with the ability of that master morality to say this is valuable, this is noble, that there's any possibility of escaping scarcity. You have to be able to say something is valuable. And the key is the ability to say something is valuable then creates intrinsic motivation to do it, right? You have motivation to do it because you say it's valuable or to observe it. But of course, the reason we don't do, say this is valuable because of fear, it takes courage, you have to stick your neck out, you get rejected by the social order and so on and so forth. You see, what ends up happening is if you provide people with comfort or money or whatever, the problem of scarcity just moves to the realm of the psyche or meaning, right? The whole meaning crisis stuff, which I know we've critiqued in the past, but there's of course truth to it. It's just overfitting it, right? There's truth to all of this. This is the whole idea of new thinking, is to get into overfit, underfit, not right and wrong, right? Underfit, overfit. And it's like with the meaning.
Just want to say quickly about, because I think this is an important distinction you're making here between old thinking being right and wrong, new thinking being overfitting, underfitting, is that if you think, because I think what has been underthought is the ontology of the meaning of the evolutionary discovery of natural selection. That it's been thought scientifically, but not thought like fundamentally ontologically for human beings. What does it mean? And the most important concept in evolutionary biological literature is fitness maximization. So when we think about underfitting and overfitting, we have to think about fitness. And like ultimately, to me, this is about the immortal, like it's almost about, brings us to questions of the immortal drive, and I think that evolutionary biologists don't think about immortal drive because they're thinking probably from a reductionist standpoint about genes or organisms or whatever, but they're not thinking about the drive of life as such. So, but I don't mean to interrupt. I thought that was an important thing to.
No, well, it's one of the reasons why I like the overfit, underfit language, because I think, one, it ties far more with an evolutionary bisect. It's about fittingness. I also think it gets into teleology, which, it depends on what you mean by that. But there's this notion lurking throughout a lot of thought of the name of the game is fittingness. But here's the thing. It seems like it can be tempting to assume that if something new emerges, the fittingness takes care of itself. Like we just know how to fit into it. No, it's contingent. Something new can emerge that we can't fit into you, ergo the alien we're not ready for, ergo it turns into Lovecraft, Ancient One reduces us to ash. So indeed, there is a natural all of these complexity science show an emergence. The mistake is assuming that the fittingness will follow with the emergence inherently and necessarily. This is what I do not buy, and I do not think Hegel buys it either. He's like, yes, there's progress, yes, there's emergence, until there's not, because you're dead. Like there's the fittingness element, it cannot be assumed.
Can I just say about the emergentist worldview and stuff like that? Because I've read the emergentist literature. It was a really important thing for me when I was doing my Global Brain Singularity doctoral thesis to read that literature. There's a very interesting narrative in that literature and so forth. But there's a definite under a lack of attention, a lack of awareness to emergence being terrifying and scary. Like yes, there's emergence, but you're always painting emergence as, oh, it's so great, we're gonna have emergent global civilization, and it's like, no, again, this dimension of thinking, the dimension of where new thought will be needed is where emergence is terrifying. Emergence is global pandemic. Emergence is like in nanotechnology, they have the somewhat funny gray goo hypothesis where nanotechnology just replicates uncontrollably and takes over the whole planet.
Sure.
Like imagine coronavirus as nanotechnology replication.
Well, it cannot be overstressed. Why? Like, so if we look at religious traditions, Krishna is terrifying in Hinduism. Blue skin, he's like, oh, Arjuna, you want to see my full form? Okay. And Arjuna's like, I am so sorry. The book of Revelation is terrifying. Angels are terrifying. They're like these eyed winged creatures in Ezekiel. It's all freaky stuff. But you see, there's a truth in all of that. There's a super important truth, which is that emergence is it's the dichotomy, it's the blending of beauty and sublimity, if we take a Burkean view, where sublimity is like this overwhelming experience, Lovecraft Ancient One, and it destroys everything. The French Revolution is sublimity, whereas beauty is a kind of contained sublimity that is ordered, that people are fitted to handle. So beauty requires the sublime to be possible, but it's beauty instead of an unleashed sublimity because people are able to handle it, basically. Like the social order has created avenues to integrate it into the system. So all beauty can become sublimity if there is not fittingness, okay? Like in Burke, right? What happened with the French Revolution, according to Burke, is that you had the same impulse of beauty that then exploded into sublimity that destroyed everything because you didn't have the social fittedness for it, or it wasn't integrated, or it turned against the social order. And what's interesting is for Burke, beauty and sublimity are deeply tied to desire, drive, psyche, libido, sexuality, all of these different things. So you see overlap between the questions, the question of motivation and the question of libido would actually end up being the same, right, in different ways. And I think Burke and a lot of the counter-enlightenment thinkers are actually very good at that. And so likewise, emergence, if you want emergence to be beautiful, well then, frick man, you better be ready. There's conditionalism, as I like to call it, conditioning that must be done so that the emergence is beautiful. You cannot assume the emergence will not be an unleashing of sublimity. If we are not fitted for it, it will be the unleashing of sublimity. And that's also why I tend to personally, and I guess this would be a conservative bent I have, is tend to prefer necessary reformation as opposed to just kind of hard doing something new, like I talked to you last time. Because is it possible to do like a new religion that is able to condition people to handle the emergence of people? Yeah, it's possible. Can you spread it to the average person? That's really hard. It can be done and it can have a really important function, but one wants to figure out how to quickly reform the pre-existing religious, socioeconomic, all of these different things, structures, to be able to be fitting for the emergence so that it's beautiful, quote unquote, a beatific vision, as opposed to a sublime terror, a new reign of terror. Like for Burke, terror and sublimity go together. And for me, the reason why an emphasis on reformation seems warranted is because of the rate of AI technological change. You know, in reading Kurzweil, you see the exponential curve, which seems to be generally true, even if the data are low. Okay, if this problem we are describing is exponentially approaching, we're out of time. Like you're out of time, right? If you're out of time, you don't have time to do something new, basically. Like, except to deal with people in the mind. I'm not saying there's no value into it, but it's probably a minority application, right? For people who genuinely need it. So I don't want to be throwing out that bathwater. But the issue is, if we're talking about a wide scale sort of cultivation of fittingness so that the emergence is beautiful instead of sublime, your strategy needs to be reformation. You need to reform capitalism, not replace capitalism. You need to reform religion, not replace religion, or Christianity. You need to reform Christianity, not replace Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and I can keep going. You need to reform even stuff like college. Like, I'm extremely critical of the college system, but this is why I like to talk about breaking down the monopoly on credentials to create competition between, say, online communities and universities, as opposed to a purely deconstructional, because that's reformational. Competition is reformation. That's very important. Competition has a reformational structure to it because you're challenging and it goes through that. So I'm all about that. And so an emphasis on reformation in my thinking tends to be where I go, simply because we're out of time, right? And doing something new doesn't tend to work. And there is a time limit. Here's the thing, though. If you assume that emergence is good, there is no time limit because it's good. All we got to do is like cultivate practices to observe the good. But if there's a possibility, if there's a possibility of emergence being terrifying, then there's a time limit. That's why that really matters. That point you're bringing up.
This literally does not come up in emergentist literature to such a comical level. It's honestly, it's not thinking. It's not, I wouldn't classify it as thinking. It's again, and it's again putting the cart before the horse with the pretty picture.
I'm afraid so.
Yeah.
because I have not had an experience. Now, again, I have not read every single emergent literature or different things like that. There
I've
is.
read I've read a lot of the great emergentists, and a lot of them come like all you have to do like, and when they apply their emergentist thinking to contemporary politics, when they apply their emergentist thinking to humanist globalization, they basically come to like some sort of liberalist democratic view. You know, they don't really, they can't actually, like, they're thinking within a political form that exists now.
Yes.
Like, so it's like, and they do it in a very naive humanist way and stuff like this.
It assumes that AA will always be fitting. It also assumes that emergence.
It's what Zizek talks about with the Fukuyama end of history. The Fukuyama end of history is that you assume the liberal democratic form is the final political form, and it's really insane the way. I mean, it is absolutely true that if you look at contemporary public intellectuals on a large scale, independent of their specific domain of intelligence, they're all liberal Democrats.
Yes. It's very interesting with Fukuyama, and Raymond's quite good on this. When you get into his books on like biotech and bioethics and all this different thing, there's this like this. It's this really weird thing Fukuyama does where he's like, "Yeah, this is really bad, but let's just return to like first principles." What? You're basically saying like there's like go back to medieval theology. Okay. That's not going to work. You can't do that, Fukuyama. You have to move into Hegel new logic. You can't just be like, let's go back to a previous AA metaphysics. That's not how that works, by the way. Also, the problem for Fukuyama is what all the sociologists, like, you know, I mentioned Berger and Reif and Hunter a lot. They all were screaming at the top of their lungs, difference is deep. It's not a tourist thing. You know, it's a, you know, you get the impression from travel that difference is just like food and clothing and things you can put on in travel. And he's like, no. They're all like, difference is ontological, basically. It is to the ground. And if you don't take that seriously, you're going to get, you know, basically Hunter wrote before the shooting again, back in the early 90s, is like, yeah, hey, guys, if we don't understand the difference is like ontological, we're going to end up with like balkanization in America is basically what he wants.
That's what's happening.
That's exactly what happened. And what is Duginism? What is Duginism but that logic on a global scale? Of course, that's what it is. Duginism
Russian truth, Western truth.
It's his multiple Daseins, as he talks about. Of course. Yeah. What else do you have? You know, unless you have AB logic. No, unless you have AB logic. But you see, if you, the other, like the way that this like new, this liberal utopianism is hiding itself is in this new kind of emergentism, which is, which there's truth to. Of course there is. And this kind of idea, like that new book, you know, that book, The Road to Reality, that Bobby Aslan or whatever wrote. But there's kind of, the universe is heading toward greater and greater complexity. Entropy is not the norm, it's the exception. But okay, that doesn't mean we will automatically have fittedness for that certain emergence in different things. And that's the kind of, it's basically what they did in economics, where they were like,
and I know this because I've been in the literature, is that this narrative of emergence, this narrative of things are complexifying, it in certain narrow specifications, there's real thinking going on here, but as a worldview, this is not thinking.
No, it's the same in economics, where you're like, hey, if we put up the right structure of incentives, everything's going to be grand. Okay, so everyone then has comfort, and then the meaning crisis or whatever, right? Because basically what ends up happening is without the ability to be intrinsically motivated, the problem of scarcity externally just moves to scarcity internally, where then you're scarce of meaning, you're scarce of motivation, you're scarce of these different things. So you've not escaped scarcity as a metric, you've just moved it internally, and then you have the mental health and whatever and so forth. But the only way to escape scarcity in your thinking is some kind of master morality, to use Nietzsche's term, the ability to say something is value, intrinsic motivation, creativity, which is an entirely different way of approaching the world. And these are all things, you know, I emphasize, because indeed, those seem to bring with them an entirely different, way of being. Like, I can't help but think, I always say, Bernard and I would talk about like the hip hop artist. How does the hip hop artist, the freestyle, approach AI technology? They're like, oh man, how do I use this? You know, boom, I'm going to integrate this into my improvisation and make it happen. I'm going to enter it into the cipher. Whereas the AA culture of like either approaches AI and you're like, yep, it's better than we are, we'll get out of the way. So the mode of the hip hop artist approaching a singularity of a kind is entirely different from someone who is incapable of the cipher or the creativity. And I think all the terms, like I was speaking with Guy Simstock, who I love, circling, dialogos, all of these are kind of speaking to an emergentism that is only possible because the people in the cipher have done the work to freestyle. This is the key. This is why I like ciphers as opposed to emergence. Because a cipher, you're only going to be any good at like improving off the dome if you've done a heck of a lot of work. Like you've practiced, you've lyrics, you've trained. You can't just walk into a cipher and go off the dome, right? Well, that's how this works. You do not become a master improviser just by stepping into a cipher. Likewise, emergence is not good just because it happens, right? You have to do the work. But you see in AA thinking, we don't even know we have work to do. So we step into the cipher and we get owned by the AI. Of course we do, because we didn't do any work and we don't know how to integrate it into the freestyle, right? But if you've done the work and you step into the cipher, that's a different ballgame. So for me, emphasizing things like the cipher, I'd much rather talk about ciphers than emergence, even though there's truth to emergence, because emergence happens in a cipher per se, an unexpected event that is only possible because of the people there that are feeding off of one another, right? So there's a kind of emergence in a cipher, but everyone would know that you can only do a cipher if you've done the work to condition to it. Otherwise, a cipher sucks. I've tried it. You step into a cipher and you're dealing with experts, it's humiliating. It's awful. It destroys your ego. Well, that's what will happen with an emergence that we're not prepared for. It is just not a variable in people thinking, in my opinion.
Yeah, a few things might be important here, like as it regards to circling and cipher and stuff like that. So I've done a lot of circling as well. I'm leading men's circles, leading different types of circles, and you know, even Sex, Masculinity, God is a cipher. That book is a cipher.
Sure.
You know, so you know, I have familiarity with this sort of discursive territory, but you know, there's strong limits even to this as well.
Of course.
You know, and you know, I would say, like, for example, at a recent French retreat I was hosting, we were doing a circling, and specifically I was deriving the categories for circling around sex, money, and power. And so, like, you have to, I mean, saying here, when we think about like a community, which is the type of circle, which is in a process of ciphering, I mean, you can think about a community in this way. You could think about a community as a circling and a ciphering process, which I think is an interesting way to think about it. You have to think about, how does the circle, how does the cipher navigate the most intractable dimensions of difference, ontological difference. So, like, I'm not saying sex, money, and power are the only categories of relevance, but they are important categories, which I think contingently are objectively important in our current time. And there are other categories we could derive to cipher and circle around these things. But if you're circling and if you're ciphering is just this, we're just disembodied cogitos online, no. That's a strong limit. And if you do this, I know there's this tendency to say dialectic to dialogos. No, you're not going to get out of dialectic this way. And so there has to be a way in which this is brought to embodied community and so forth, in order for it not, because at least for me, I've exhausted the whole digital cogitos doing circling and ciphering. It has a limit. And it has and it's specifically with ontological differences. And I think I want to emphasize, because you were emphasizing how important it is to think difference ontologically, is that I think that this is why, one of the reasons why Zizek is the philosopher of the moment for me, and the philosopher of our era for me, is that he actually is capable of thinking ontological difference, and specifically emphasizing the sexual difference. He also thinks class difference, and here mirroring libidinal economy with Freud and Marx. You have sexual difference, you have class difference. We have to think this. I just have written a paper which is going to be published next year in a continental philosophy journal published through the Birkbeck University, where I introduce the concept, and here just building on Zizek, or attempting to build on Zizek, of what I call the immortal difference. And the immortal difference is the difference between life and death itself. So my point here is just that when we think sexual difference, class difference, I would also say a mortal difference, the difference between life and death itself. I think that this is where we need what I would call circling or ciphering in the real.
Yes, completely.
And that's a whole other qualitative order. It requires yes, we need that type of what happens to me. What my view is the circling and the ciphering helps to de-rigidify the intellectual mind, but that is not sufficient for the level of difference that we are going to be encountering in this whatever friggin' world we're entering into.
1,000 billion%. So the way I've been thinking about it, I've been talking about line, circle, spiral, cone. A line has been what kind of AA thinking progress. You have a line and it's going somewhere. The problem is the line can be lost. You can't necessarily assume it's progress. So then an update to that would be sort of a circle. And Chad Hegel will talk about progress and circle, where you're kind of going back and you have that negating, sublating because you're revisiting. The problem is the circle can be in place, right? And a circle can kind of be repetitive. And also it may not have progress because it's just going in circles. The ancient world, part of the problem with the ancient world is that a notion of sort of secular history, circular history that didn't have any progress part of it. In the great revolution of kind of Western thinking and the scientific was, no, there's a progress, right? So that's very good. But then the problem is a spiral, kind of following, say, Milton or something. A spiral is where you start with a point and then it becomes a circle, but it's actually chaotic. It's spiraling out and there's no center to it, right? It's just going everywhere. And that's what's happening now with globalization, right? You have this kind of spiraling out difference because we all wanted to tell ourselves that we are unified by rationality, but in fact, no, rationality doesn't make a foundation under us. It can't do it because you can't have it. But the cone is where you start with a circle of difference, where you say, no, we're definitely different, but we're going to be unified at the top almost by a singularity ahead of us, right? Where you have this kind of movement, instead of it in greater chaos, you're actually seeing the singularity as a call for speculative reasoning that can actually have a unity in the difference, where the foundation of it is in fact the difference and the separation that is circling to a point. Now, there are always limits to geometrical representation, of course, but absolutely for me, this is where the desperate need, like when we talk about like the movement from, say, dialectic to dialogos, there's really not a meaningful difference unless you're working into the real, right? Like, what is the actual difference in the step? Does it just get faster? Does it just kind of get speed up? It has to go into the real. Now, again, someone like Guy Senstock, his whole thing is to bring it into the real of your relationships, to bring it into the real of what you're doing with. So the whole question now is, how do we bring the online into the real of economics, the real of personal relationships, the real? If you do not bring it into the real, then you're dealing with a circle that ultimately is running in place, not a cone that is then making a pointed transformation in these different areas. And that's one way I've been thinking about it. So completely, and for me, the way you get to the cone from the cipher or the circle is basically everyone in it has to have an A-B logic. A cipher doesn't magically, you can't just have cipher be another necessarily working emergence, right? Where it just magically works because you're doing it. No, then it's not practically any different from like emergentist thinking that's overly idealistic. Everyone has to bring a certain way of thinking and operating in the world so that the cipher can become a cone, per se, right? Well, that's why Hegel's science, this is why the new logic is so freaking important. Like, you can't skip it. And it makes the singularity at the heart of your thinking, or the conflict of mind, or the real is at the heart of your thinking, and it has to go there. But we don't want to go there because then you could fail. Then you could mess up. Then you could have misunderstanding. And this is why I do like Mr. Ebert. When Mr. Ebert said the meaning of life is courage, I thought that was really succinct. Like, there has to be, that's why, like, when we
would agree.
What's that? I completely.
Nietzsche would agree, and the history of, I think his theory of evolution was actually related to courage.
I think courage and fearlessness, my favorite, again, with just Christianity, the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's fear. Like, the opposite of faith is fear, actually. And that's where you got this emphasis on, like, the one who fears is not made perfect. And love is like fear is bad. It's like afraid. And that's why, like, if there's too much emphasis on meaning being the problem, the meaning crisis, you need to have meaning. Although there's truth to all of that. I use that language. I understand what it's getting at. But the meaning is secondary to courage. Like, from acting and courage, meaning can come. You can't make meaning primary because you won't necessarily have courage that comes from it.
I've been thinking more about this, and I actually think Hegel would say meaning is secondary. Yeah. Yes. I don't think he would say it's primary. I think he would say meaning is primary to ordinary consciousness.
Yes.
But to absolute knowing, meaning is secondary. And I think that even there's a passage in The Science of Logic where he talks, and it's very convincing as well, is that philosophical cognition should operate from the standpoint where whether or not you exist, or whether or not, he says, well, in this order, he says, whether or not you have $100 or whether or not you exist is of no difference.
Absolutely.
Is of no consequence. And so that really makes meaning secondary right away.
Well, when you are speculatively reasoning about something, it can't have meaning really, other than a notion. It can have a notion, but can it have meaning? Not really. The whole point is you're going to try. You're going to give it a shot.
Meaning can be a trap as well. Yeah. So,
absolutely.
And I just want to say quickly, because this is something I've also thought about for a while. I don't know if I'm 100% using the concepts correctly, but I think I am. Is that the movement, a spiraling spurious infinity that moves away from a center is, I think, a centrifugal force, whereas a movement towards a center, a spiral that goes towards a center, would be a centripetal force. I think that these physical notions are probably not as important as I think they are, but I think that anyway, for people who have those models, that would be what we're pointing towards.
Well, a few things. If creativity is central, and Hyrule made that great point on how the spiral is a source of chaos, and I think that's really important. Creativity, you phenomenologically experience creativity as a gathering of difference to a point. A gathering of difference to a point. Like, you have all these ideas and you're kind of gathering it, right? And you're intrinsically motivated to go and make connections between all these differences that are not self-evident and figure out a way to bring it together, right? So there is something, but in order to have that bringing together where you're creating a force that's coming together to a point, there has to be a creative spirit, which requires courage, because it is not self-evident how those things connect, right? And it especially requires courage when you're bringing them to a point that you cannot fully understand. And I could have, like, this notion of making the singularity the point. The creative act feels like that. Like, if you were to ask what is, like, the Turn the World or these different novels, they don't feel reducible to your intentions. It feels like creating something that you can't fully capture. It's in a point, but the thing at the point is then very difficult to categorize, even though you made it. That's what's so weird. It feels like you made it, but it's alive. It's very strange. Well, that's the point.
It's like a child.
Yes.
It's like
yes.
You created a child, but it's not going to fit into your categories. In fact, the difference between wanting followers and wanting children is the difference between wanting to fit subjects into your categories and wanting subjects to find their own categories.
That's 100%. And you see, great works of art feel alive. Children's are alive. And also with children, you can do everything right and still screw up. And there's accident and there's unknown. Like, you're doing everything right and then they fall off their bike and get hurt, right? Like, there's such a surprise element that is inherent in the child. But if you choose to be a parent, you're basically saying, I'm going to be ready for the surprise. Like, I'm going to have the courage to face the unknown, right? Well, that is a certain mode of being. Like you've said before, and I think it's so true, that too many children are having children. 100%. Like, too many childish people are having children. And in order for them to be childlike, you have to be childlike yourself in a Nietzschean sense. But if you're childish, it's not going to happen. So basically, what ends up happening is all AA logic at it's the only product that it can make is people that today are childish, not childlike. In the past, when it was fitting, it could make childlike people. But now, to apply AA logic is overfitting, and it can only produce childish people as opposed to Nietzschean childlike people. So the name of the game is, how do we have a model to produce childlikeness, of which is utterly, utterly necessary, given the singularity, the AI, and all of the pathological responses that will happen. Well, this is where you have to go to Hegel. This is where you have to take seriously AB logic. There is no possibility of a cone in AA, basically. Like, AA is either going to give you a line, it's going to give you a circle, or it's going to give you a spiral. If you want AB,
we got to go beyond both the circle and the line models.
Yes, absolutely. You've got to get something more, three-dimensional.
Well, you got to sublate the circle and the line at the same time. But But
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
you
what's
can get there
happened?
with logic.
Well, where postmodernism is correct in giving us the spiral per se, is it's kind of got the right form. It just needs to flip it. It just needs to have the circle on the bottom up to the point to create a cone, right? That's my critique. As you know, that's my critique of spiral dynamics, is that it describes kind of a spiral structure of personal and intellectual evolution. I think it's actually more like a cone, but
well, actually, in my doctoral thesis, Global Brain Singularity, I have in one of the early chapters, I have a model of the universe, which is a cone coming out from the Big Bang. So the point is the Big Bang, and then you have a expanding universe,
sure,
which expands into complete disorder. And then on the next page, I have the inverse,
yes,
which focuses on the singularity towards the global brain singularity. So it's an inverse cone towards the singularity, like you're saying. So yeah, these two models, and it's interesting to now what's super interesting, and I talked a little bit about this in our previous conversation about one of the chapters in my thesis, is that to think both of those cones dialectically. Now that's interesting to think.
Yes. Well, the thing is, what's interesting is basically under postmodernism has just followed an objective logic of being like the universe. So it's a spiral. It spreads out into a spiral. What's interesting is that we have to think the AB to get a cone, and then you have a cone versus a spiral, and now there's dialectic and now new speculative reason. Like this is like the next, but you can't even begin that speculative reason until you get to the place where you've taken Hegel seriously, and therefore you can have a subject that has a cone that can be dialectically considered with the universe as a spiral, and that's then where it would be like a frontier of speculative reasoning. So I think that's extremely interesting, and that's where I'm like talking now and thinking so much about what I'm calling like Hegel's unknown. Like what is that like over the periphery sort of crazy land of speculative reasoning. But no, so I think it's fascinating to think. But so yeah, like again, postmodernism is not quote unquote wrong in the sense of it provides the form. The issue is that if that is overfit and not flipped per se to then make a cone. But you see, if you make a cone,
I can say something here because I've come up with a model. I've had this model for a few years now, but I haven't written anything on it, which is it's a model that involves Plato, Hegel, and Deleuze as historical objectivities of philosophy, and a model which folds back in on itself. So it starts with Plato and it ends with Plato, where the idea here is that Plato's trying to think the one, but he can only think of it as an eternal external idea.
right.
Then Hegel internalizes the idea to a historical process, and then Deleuze divides the idea into a multiplicity, but then each of those multiplicities are a one, bringing us back to Plato. And now this is my joke here. I have this in the book. I think you've already read it. It's not out yet. The joke here is 1,000 Platos instead of 1,000 plateaus.
That's hilarious.
So I don't know. I'm proud of that. I think it's funny, and it's an interesting way to think about it. But anyway, it's a way in which I would sublate Plato instead of deconstructing Plato. And it's a way in which here's my view on Plato, which I take from Lacan, is that it's interesting to read Plato from a psychoanalytic point of view.
Absolutely.
I think psychoanalyzing ancient philosophers as opposed to deconstructing them is, not saying both could be done, but the psychoanalytic viewpoint is an interesting one to bring into philosophy.
Completely. In the same way that bringing the question up, for me, it's always been like, once you introduce motivation to theology, philosophy, literature, all these things, everything kind of it changes. Everything transforms and that's the move that needs to be done. And I really love the play on 1,000 Platos instead of 1,000 Platos, because as I told you, I think that exactly is what occurs. You get an AA, a BB, a CC, and every single one of them.
It's the difference between centrifugal and centripetal.
Completely. I think it's
1,000 plateaus in. I've heard like Deleuzians describe it. It sounds very centrifugal, meaning moving away from a center, thinking in a multiplicity without any one.
Yeah, and again, that's going to help you avoid the totalitarianism of the state, but it's going to lead you into some of the trouble we have now, right? Of the fragmentation and different things. So the question is, how can we sublate both? And likewise, I've just gotten to the point, like with Plato, it's the same with Kant, same with any, like I think it's important to get to the point where you stop going, Plato's an idiot, or Kant is an idiot, and you start saying overfit, underfitting. And that would be...
How arrogant is that? I can't stand that. Like, I can't stand, like, you know, I'm thinking here, like, you know, I spend my Friday nights like having like sympathy for Descartes because people just say, oh, I think therefore I am, so stupid. Like just like reducing him to like one silly thing or something like that.
Oh, yes.
Like when, like, I mean, what are the chances that you're smarter than Descartes? Like, what are the chances that you're smarter than Kant? I mean, probably not.
It would be difficult for me to overstress that. I mean, Descartes' a great example. Like, it's funny you bring that up, you know, with like Pei mentioning that. I've been revisiting the first meditation, and in the same way that Anselm gets reduced to the ontological proof, and he's way more than the ontological proof. He didn't even call it an ontological proof. There is far more going on in Descartes.
Lacan knew this.
Yes, and
Lacan treats Descartes in an interesting way.
Well, anyway. It's just so easy to be like, they're dumb. You're not smarter than them. You're not. You're not.
Yeah, you gotta approach. It's the same with science. You have to go in with a certain humbleness. You have to go in with a certain humility. You know, like, yeah, it's very easy to throw around dead guys because they're not here to like respond to you. You know, like.
That's so funny. Well, a few more things.
My view is my whole, and this is the principle of Philosophy Portal, is to take the time with foundational text.
Yeah.
You know, and especially in, you know, especially in the contemporary information ecology where you have very clickbaity, very short text, very, you know, there's not this tendency to like deep reading of the foundational text. No, I think now is the time to do deep readings of foundational texts.
I think so. Because, you know, as just a quick point on it, because a lot more can be said, you'd be amazed. You'd be amazed at how wrong you remember books. Like when you go back and reread them, you're like, I don't remember this. It's like when I went back and reread book 7 of the Republic, I'm like, oh, this totally transforms what's going on with the allegory of the cave. It just blew my mind.
I'm also, and I know you've talked about this in previous podcasts, but I'm also a big supporter of the rereading. And I think that this brings us to, I think the rereading and the emphasis on rereading foundational text brings us to the difference between true infinity and spurious infinity. Yes. When it comes to the habits that people get into with books, where you read, you focus on reading every popular book that came out once, instead of reading the foundational text many times. And I think that the advantage to reading the foundational text many times over reading every new popular book that comes out once is that you get a unbearable density of thought, to use a Zizkian word.
I think that's completely the case. I think it's in the same way that there's kind of cone structure. When you're younger, yeah, you have to kind of read a bunch and to figure out. But as you get older, the circle needs to start coming in toward a sort of point where, like, I basically reread books now. I don't do as many new books unless it's a friend or something.
This might be a function of age.
Yeah,
like when you're 20, you might want to do a full ecology overview, and then you get older, you go zero in.
Absolutely. Now, there's a few, like I've been revisiting Whitehead and Bergson because I've been convinced there's something there, but notice it's like revisiting, right? And so there is, and you know, there is every now and then I did read, you know, anyway, some new econ book, but really the dominance of my reading now is very much in rereading. I was always taken, he's kind of tongue in cheek, but when Lewis was like, the only books you ever read are the ones you read twice. I thought that was hilarious. And I've always kind of stuck with that. Well, a few more things before I run off. I'm so sad because I've enjoyed this so much, but I, alas, have some commitments and things, but this has been magnificent. But I've really enjoyed this. A few more things. I think one of the reasons why it can also be problematic to assume that emergence is going to be good is because it almost like rationalizes Deleuze. Because if there's like this spreading out into a spurious infinity, don't worry, guys. The more difference there are, the more there's going to be emergence between them, and it's going to bring them all together. And we don't have to do anything but express our essential difference. You have to do the work of condition.
I think in Zizkian philosophy, that's called a nightmare.
So it's a big problem to kind of assume that the emergence will take care of the
problem of essential difference by actually like arising to something that will unify it somehow in a certain way. And that's kind of an assumption that then makes you not have to do work. And one should always be careful with any assumption that saves you work or the need to have courage. Like if you can have a worldview that just happens to make it the case that you don't have to do anything you're scared to do, you should be a little skeptical of that. A good heuristic for determining where you should direct your skepticism is relative to what you're afraid of. That is where skepticism should be directed. And that's actually generally a pretty good heuristic to keep skepticism from becoming cynicism, right?
Well, I tell you, if you ask that Cadell Last guy what he's scared of, it's building a business, and
yes.
and you know, I've kicked him in the butt a few times and try to get him on that, but you know, I've had some conversations with other professors who spent their life as professors, and they said if they didn't get a tenured professor job, they wouldn't have known what to do with themselves.
Right.
And I feel like I increasingly find myself in that situation where I don't really believe in the old university models. I don't believe that they're truly competitive. I mean, the truth is not there in the competition, which is what I care about. And, you know, starting a business, trying to do Philosophy Portal, to me often feels like an impossible challenge. And sometimes I do find myself in pretty difficult existential or psychological situations or conditions. But I really do think that rereading foundational texts and bringing these texts to life for the deepest problems in science, spirituality, religion, politics, economics is absolutely essential. And even though, you know, being on the marketplace and trying to market myself, I have a lot of resistances to it. What I can guarantee to people who want to get on board with Philosophy Portal is that I am committed to over delivering on value, and that you are going to get a proper introduction to foundational philosophy.
And I think that is beyond critical and importance today. I think it is incredibly important that quote unquote intellectuals try to be entrepreneurial intellectuals, beyond just merely speaking tours, beyond just merely speaking and getting paid for it, because that's how you encounter the real. You said it, I loved when you said it, that the real of economics. That is so important to encounter, because it emulates the encounter of the singularity. And if one has to think economics and application and how to apply it, it transforms your thinkings in ways that makes it toward AB, because you have to speculatively reason how that can be done. And it's insanely difficult, but it is that insane difficult of which is utterly paramount for us to engage in the new logic, so that we are not pathologically effaced by the alien of which is coming. So I salute you for that endeavor. I think it is very important. I certainly think that your emphasis on the rereading of these texts and rethinking them as contemporary, not just relics of history, is a necessary approach. No, that's exactly right. As a contemporary endeavor is extremely important. I appreciate what you're doing. And I certainly hope that anyone who has watched this program sees the imperative to take your class, and that they will do so and sign up today. So Dr. Cadell Last, thank you for what you do.
It's a great conversation space that you open here, Daniel. And it's, you know, I spend the large majority of my waking hours deep into philosophical texts that often I don't have the space to really unpack my notion, but I really enjoyed this podcast, and I feel like this was a space where I could do that. So thank you.
Well, that means the world, because that's the hope. So thank you, Cadell Last. I appreciate it, sir.